Okay, let's talk about a concerted strategy. If climate change were to make it past the politics, and if one of your candidates with climate change as a top issue.
I'm neutral. I just want to say I'm neutral on the Democratic primary. You know, any of these people.
Anybody?
Yeah, anybody.
I see, okay. If anybody.
Anyone who supports climate change.
I see. If any of them were to win and you actually were able to get things through Congress, the other big if, right, no matter who's controlling Congress, let's talk about some of what might be done. And you're the climate, the Center for American Progress's 100% Clean Future report has a series of benchmarks and a series of areas of investment that you call for. And let's climb into some of those and talk about what could actually happen in your view if this were to move forward. Let's start with agriculture. Okay?
Yeah.
Because you talked about that. We all eat food. It comes from the ground, it gets transported, it needs to be refrigerated, it's packaged, it consumes a lot of energy from farm to table, right? So farmers, as you say, have not been at the forefront of this, but they have signed on. What are some of the changes that your report calls for in the where our food comes from that would make a big change as far as climate change is concerned?
Well, there's all kinds of things that you could have farmers do to hold in methane gases. But actually, this is an area of innovation. You know, there's technologies we can use to ensure that you better use data to inform farmers of how they could best use the soil to recapture carbon. And this is not only a domestic issue, but it's an international issue. There's a lot we could do around the world to better ensure that the soil is basically bringing back into it carbon from the atmosphere. And we can have our farmers be part of that. There are innovations that we need to invest in agriculture to make some of that happen. But I think this is like an area that's interesting. You don't really think of innovation in agriculture as a climate solution, but it is one of the areas, and that's an area that we can push on.
Another area of benchmarking for you is electrification and how we use electricity. So what would that involve?
See, this is what I think is people should be incredibly optimistic about the changes. 10 years ago, if you talked about how quickly you could move renewables into the grid, I think people are frankly surprised by how fast that pace is. So we could really get to a place where we're 100% renewables. We do have continuing challenges. For example, you know, renewables are dependent on things like the wind and the sun. So when it gets super cloudy, you have to be able to back up energy. So that is an innovation we still need to address. But I go back to the example, I'll take two examples, Texas and New Mexico. These are two states that are oil producing. Big constituencies for oil production in those states. New Mexico is leading on basically moving to renewables. They're not giving up entirely on everything they've done, but they're creating new standards so that they move to a almost 100% renewable economy. And you know, they have a lot of sun and the ability to address solar and use solar. And so I think this is a big concerted federal push we can do, but the ability to actually move most of our grid to renewables over the next 10 years is much, much more realistic than I think people believe or have believed.
Electric cars in this country now are selling better than they ever have, but they represent about 1.5% of all the cars sold. It takes 12 to 14 years to turn over a car fleet. What would you call for? What is your report?
Well,
call for accelerating that.
We call for moving the fleet to electric. We call for, but you know, one of the reasons why electric cars are at the level they are, although I will say I drive an electric car, but one of the reasons as a driver of an electric car is that we don't have an infrastructure for it, right? People are still mindful of they're not charging stations all around the country. If you drive long distance, there's no charging station for you. So there is a chicken and egg with electrification, which is we actually have to create a grid in the country. You know, we've done things like that before.
And your report calls for that.
Yes,
There's a big price tag for that.
There is, well.
So how does that get paid for?
So the price tag is there's a private sector part of that. The place where you have to have the real public investment is in places, putting electrification in places where people go to rarely. So the price tag we think through for all of this, right, is, we call for trillions of dollars of investment in addressing these things, but we also recognize that taking action on climate helps our economy.
Where do the trillions come from, Neera?
Oh, great. We're happy to answer that question. We have tax proposals where we do two things. One is we increase taxes on wealthy Americans, but we also believe that we have to have some form of tax on carbon.
Okay, that hasn't worked very well.
Well, what do you say worked very well?
Well,
politically,
we tried a few years ago. We had an effort to do a BTU tax. You remember that? That flopped. Capture and carbon capture, cap and trade. Trade that didn't pass. Australia had a carbon tax that then flopped. So where has it worked? How do you?
Well,
this country is allergic to all taxes. It seems, right? So to go out there and call for a tax increase, never mind a carbon tax, how do you make that happen?
So the Center for American Progress has long proposed a carbon tax that is refundable for middle-class families, and people who are struggling to get in the middle class. So for the majority of consumers, they would get a rebate from the carbon tax. And the benefit of the carbon tax is that it is actually changing behavior, right? So you're right that there are forms of carbon taxes that have not worked in the past. But it's also the case that we have structures for a carbon tax in a sense, which is we have a gas tax, which is an energy tax, and this is actually a better and fairer way to do it.
So this raises another question that comes from another student. This is Valerie Gutierrez. She happens to come from Middlebury College, and her question is about marginalized communities and climate change. Let's see what she's got to say.
Hi, Frank and Neera. Thank you for having this conversation with us. I was wondering if you can shed some light on some of the ways that environmental policy is taking marginalized communities into consideration, particularly low-income communities of color.
It's a great question. So we see particular examples of this, and we talk about this in our report, which is the way California essentially had created a version of a cap and trade program and raised them with the money that they raised. They invested, or really actually not just invested, they worked with local communities to address particular environmental challenges. So in Los Angeles, the challenges around asthma really worked directly with mothers in communities of color, Latino communities, African American communities, determining what they need to address their environmental problems, which are multifold. So I think this is one of the values that we talk about in our plan, is that you have to actually, at the front end, think through both the environmental justice piece, but also the worker and labor piece, which is how do we get, which is to determine policies that will ensure that we have good paying jobs at the end of this process, but we're also taking into account all communities. And we should be honest that often in the environmental conversations, we've sometimes lost sight of how communities of color and low-income communities are disproportionately impacted. And so, that means they're disproportionately impacted in siting of pollution locations. And also, we should be mindful that if we don't insulate low-income communities from some of the costs of addressing climate, what we're really saying is that people who are already struggling have to bear that burden. And I actually think making the case of how you're going to insulate those communities and broader communities makes it easier to communicate how you're going to actually solve this problem, and in a way that doesn't fall trapped to the opponents.
Sure. I want to ask you this. It's very interesting what's taken place, and I'm sure our audience here has noticed it, and that is the difference in the way climate change is being covered in the media and the way a lot of media are reporting on this story. I was recently out in Arizona, and I picked up this thing. I was not in a museum to find a newspaper. I actually found it in my hotel. It's encouraging to hold a newspaper again. But right on the front page of the Arizona Republic, there's a story right here. It says, Climate 2020, a hot, dry state pursues solutions as planet warms. And this is the second paragraph of this story.
Yeah, and Arizona has a Republican governor today.
And a senator.
Yep, and a senator.
And you think they're vulnerable?
Yes.
Okay. So what they wrote in this story, Arizona, as one of the hottest, driest, and fastest warming parts of the country, faces major challenges as the world continues to heat up with the burning of fossil fuels. There's no equivocation there. There's no suggestion of equivalency or debate. That's just flat out a statement. CNN has made a decision, and they refer to climate as the climate crisis. But the New York Times, not too long ago, and I'm sure many people saw it, wrote a very shocking, not shocking, because it's not surprising in some ways, but disturbing story. And it said, no one, here's the headline, no one believes anything voters worn out by a fog of political news. It's just so much information, so much counter programming, and despite stories like this and a different way of covering this in the mainstream media, people still confused, and they're just sort of shutting down. So my question to you is, as you think about your party, and actually perhaps all parties addressing this issue and trying to get the public to focus on some really tough choices, like a carbon tax, like accelerating some of these very expensive programs. And yet we have a media on the one hand, some of it which is stating it as a fact, but on the other, and in social media, challenging everything, and fact isn't fact, and the public is shutting down. How do you focus a complicated conversation, one of our earlier questions, over time, to produce outcomes and get to a very important place that's going to require compromise and trade-offs?
So one of the, I think the thing to be mindful about in this debate is the nature, is human nature. I mean, all political communication has to take into account human nature. And I think one of the things we should recognize is the more you make something sound like a disaster that there's nothing to do anything about.
I'm powerless.
That you're basically creating a system where you have very negative information and there's no plan of how to do it. You're basically inviting people to shut down, right? So in research that we did several years ago, we found that with voters really around the country, the more you just talked about a climate emergency and stoked the problem by itself, the more people became scared, and really there is a shut-off mechanism, which is it's such an overwhelming problem.
The more you talk about the doomsday thing.
The doomsday, and you don't give them a plan, then the more they just think, it's like bad news, I just have to it's like the ostrich response, right? News is so bad, I just need to turn away. There's nothing I can do about it, so I turn away. So that's why I think it is really vital. And one of the reasons why we did our report was actually it's really vital to demonstrate a plan to deal with a problem and to be optimistic about that plan. This is a plan that if we do it, the country, the economy, and our planet will be better off. We can show leadership to the world. And the trade-offs are not so great. And most importantly, if you take this action now, you are averting the crisis, not living with it. So I have worked for a number of very talented political leaders from Bill Clinton to Barack Obama, and what I learned from both of them, or many of them, I also worked for Hillary Clinton and many others, is that the best leaders recognize a challenge, but also lead people down a path of solving that problem. And you can do that by bringing them along on how the plan, taking action, will actually reduce the fears they have.
The campaign is already marked by this vast and divisive range of issues, so let's talk about some of those, from impeachment to Medicare for all to loaded terms like corruption or socialism.
I don't consider them loaded. I think they're accurate.
Socialism? You think socialism is
corruption,
accurate?
I would say.
I see. Okay. Well, you're selecting. You start with impeachment. Is impeachment the 800-pound gorilla here that sucks all the air out of the room, to mix my metaphors, and none of these other issues is really going to get attention until this is resolved, if it's resolved?
I would actually say, if you actually go see the candidates' town halls in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, They actually are asked about healthcare and climate and droughts and education. They're rarely, if you actually just see most of them, they're really rarely asked about impeachment. I think that's because voters think this impeachment process is happening, it's underway, it's in Washington. Pelosi sort of has it under control. So I do think actually voters are asking the candidates about their policy.
Do you worry, though, that impeachment could boomerang on Democrats? That impeachment?
No. And I'll tell you why. I think the support for impeachment is growing. We have a majority support for the inquiry. 70% of Americans think, and just a poll out of the last couple of days, think the president did something very wrong. I think the question that will come to the country is whether he should be removed for these actions. But it is surprising to me how strong support for removal is before we've had the public trial. So I have a unique experience.
You don't think what we've been seeing on television in recent days is a public, it's not a trial, but it's certainly testimony.
It's definitely a public trial, but the president hasn't given his defense or none,
But his numbers don't move. His base is solid, or it seems to be.
So I think that's really not. It's true that they don't move dramatically, but there are movements between. He has a range. He's at between like 37 and 43%. We should be clear. Donald Trump has never had majority support, and really importantly, I have this unique vantage point, which is that I worked for Bill Clinton in the White House during the Clinton impeachment, and to be crystal clear about the Clinton impeachment. There was never majority support for the inquiry, nor was there majority support. There was strong opposition to removal.
And what happened in the next midterms?
So, but this is really instructive.
It was bad for Democrats.
Yes, because it was never popular. It was good for it was bad for Republicans because it was never popular in the Clinton impeachment. By 2000, though, I would argue I worked on Hillary Clinton's Senate race. It was a drag to both Hillary and Al Gore that the country went through that, and there was basically Bill Clinton got off. If you remember, George Bush ran on, "I'm going to restore honor and integrity to the White House." It was a clear attack on Bill Clinton's conduct, and I do think actually Americans didn't want Bill Clinton removed, but they wanted a greater punishment. And my argument and my view about this is if the country, which already thinks that right at this moment Donald Trump did something seriously wrong, if he is fully exonerated and he's punished in no way, I do not think that will help the Republican Party. And I would just say, in the 2 test cases we've had in the last couple of weeks, there was a governor's race in Kentucky, a state that Trump won by 20 points, where the incumbent Republican governor attacked on impeachment. He said he tried to link his opponent to impeachment and attacked the impeachment process, even though he had really nothing to do with it. He attacked Democrats on impeachment, said this was a strategy of hurting the president. And the Democrat won, and won in some counties that have been very traditionally Republican.
No, but I was just speaking with a Republican about this race, though, who then quickly reminded me that every other race in the state went to Republicans virtually. And
I know, but so
it was
what
a
does
very
that
unpopular governor he was running.
Exactly, but he was the only candidate who actually ran on impeachment.
Another issue, healthcare, that tops the list and most people's priorities consistently. Does it stay that way for the next through this campaign? Healthcare is the issue in this country?
I think healthcare will be a central issue. I also think the economy will be a central issue. Healthcare is not. I think the way voters think about healthcare is not disconnected from the economy. I think that most voters are thinking of healthcare through the lens of how much it costs. It's how much premiums are. And so I do think it'll be an area of opportunity. I think the challenge in the Democratic primary is how to navigate that debate so that healthcare is a benefit to Democrats and not something that they have to worry about going into an election.
Let me ask you one last question on this, on the politics of this cycle, and then we'll open it up to the questions.
It's gone by so quickly.
From our audience. I have the great privilege here at George Washington University of working with amazing students every day, brilliant, wonderful, committed students, mostly. No,
all
of
them.
all of them. They're great. And there's something that's very interesting that we're seeing in this political cycle that I'm curious as you think about the election ahead, as you've looked at your own polling, and talk to people inside what your take on that is. And that is the youth vote and the turnout of the youth vote and the activism of youth. A few weeks ago here at GW, we hosted David Hogg. David Hogg is the young man who survived the Parkland shooting.
We've done work with him
in
Center for
Florida,
American Progress.
and and he helps lead the March for Our Lives movement, which has mobilized millions of young people. When I was in Arizona recently, I met a young man named Kyle Klein from the University of Arizona, and he is the Tucson co-lead of the Arizona Youth Climate Strike. And he has been out getting young people in the streets and stopping traffic and doing protests and making a lot of noise around climate. And through social media and remarkable organizational tools, young people have the ability to organize in ways that actually, if you think about it, has never been possible before in human history. Yet, even with a great increase in the youth vote in 2018, which was up substantially, it was still only about 40%. So where do you see the youth vote going? Does it turn out in record numbers? What are organizations such as yours, and this is going to be playing on both sides of the political aisle, doing to encourage the youth vote? What's happening there?
Well, I feel remiss in not making this point earlier in the conversation, but one of the most important issues around climate is that it is a gateway issue for young people, meaning for young voters, for youth voters, for millennial voters, for Gen Z voters, having a position which you don't believe in climate or you don't want to take any action on climate just turns those voters off immediately. It just means that you're so out of step that they're not willing to listen to you. So climate is a really important mobilization issue also for the youth vote, and I think it's important for all candidates to recognize that. I am incredibly optimistic about the young youth vote turnout, and I think that's
What do you think it's going to be?
I think the percentage of young people who turn out will be approaching 60%.
60%?
In the presidential election. So I have a theory about the presidential election, which is in 2018, we had the largest turnout we've had in 100 years. It went up 13%. So in 2014, it was 39%. It went up to 52%. You know, still a little embarrassing to be only at 52%, but that is a giant surge in votes. And so my own view is you could say, oh, the midterms brought all these people out, or you could say, we're just going to, everybody's going to turn it. You're going to have you could have a 10% increase in turnout in 2020. I think, you know, just as a strategy, we should assume everyone's turning out. Trump's voters are turning out. Progressive voters are turning out. I do think young voters many of whom thought Hillary was going to win in 2016, didn't feel like there was a reason to turn out. Some voted third party for various reasons. I think a lot of young voters look around and say, if I didn't have a reason to vote, this is like the time. And we saw a big surge in 2018. One of the big challenges, one of the reasons Republicans had confidence that they would maintain the House is because younger voters and people of color have historically not turned out in a midterm, right? They really slough off. But what happened in the youth vote is that they kept the same share they kept in a presidential, meaning they had a huge surge from 2014. And, you know, it's a lot harder to vote. You don't know who your candidate is. There aren't races everywhere. And yet young people turned out at record numbers across the country. And so my own view is that one of the benefits of a very diverse field on the Democratic Party side is you see a lot of different candidates. We have young candidates. We have a lot of old candidates. We have
I think you just called them old. I heard that.
We have older candidates. We have, people. We have multiple women. We have multiple people of color running. I do think people can see a diverse field and see a path for them.
I lied. I said that was going to be my last question before going to the audience Q&A, but I would be remiss, especially in invoking David Hogg's name, if I didn't ask you about guns and how that very difficult issue where you're balancing, serious calls, passionate calls across the country and within your party to do something about it with Second Amendment rights, how you see a successful candidate handling the gun issue on your side of the aisle.
Interestingly, climate and guns are not so dissimilar in that the independent vote has shifted on that issue. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be mindful of the conservative critique, but you need to address it. So, what's interesting to me is the assault weapons ban, which was an anathema issue just 10 years ago, is now strong majority support. So I think there's a way to talk about background checks and an assault weapons ban that does it in a way that really communicates to voters who are fearful, on the other side, that you're not going to take away their guns. And I think one of the ways to do that is to talk about assault weapons as really a weapon of war and to really talk through, do you really need that kind of weapon while maintaining people's protections of their Second Amendment rights?
All right, I'd like to open it up for the audience questions, and we'll put a mic in the middle. While we're moving the mic to the middle, perhaps we can go to one last video question that we've got here. This is from Jake Myers. Jake is a student as well, and while we're listening to Jake's question, for those of you who'd like to ask a question, please make your way to this mic. But let's start with Jake right here.
Hi, my name is Jake Myers, Planet 4 correspondent here in Tucson, Arizona. I'm here in an urban green lot where wildlife kind of can come and take shelter, but it's also a place where some of the more vulnerable people in our society, like the homeless, take shelter in extreme temperatures and during the monsoon season. So my question is, as we plan for urban resilience, how can we ensure that our most vulnerable populations are accounted for?
Yeah, I think that goes to the environmental justice question, which is, I think we have to actually think through from the perspective of the least vulnerable or the most vulnerable, how we are addressing their needs community by community, right? And so in resilience,
that's a local level.
It is a local level, but I do think from a federal perspective, you need to think through what funds you're handing over to local areas, because if the challenge we have in policymaking is, unless we actually put money on the table from the federal level, what often happens is the people with the most political voice allocate the existing resources. So that's been true on school funding, on a whole host of issues. So the way we structure it is to think through a federal-state partnership of how you're actually allocating resources so that communities in greatest need have access to those funds, which is a way that California is structured.
And it's back to the very interesting conversation in climate change about those who are most vulnerable or the poorest, whether they're native populations, people living in communities like this, in very hot and getting increasingly hotter parts of the world.
Climate, the reality is that climate impact is felt unequally, just like a whole host of other policies, right? So people who have resources to address these challenges can manage them, and people who don't have resources, when something happens, like a flood or something else, they're basically wiped out. So, from an equity and justice perspective, we have to think through how we reverse that. The people who have the least resources should have the most help.